If someone knocked on your door at 3 in the morning and a small voice, calm, practiced, impossibly patient, said, "Let us in," what would you do? Most of us will answer with the kind of confident shrug that only works in daylight. We tell ourselves we would be brave, we'd check the peephole, we'd call the police. We tell ourselves these things because no one wants to imagine their life crystallizing into one terrible, irreversible decision at an hour when the world is at its most quiet. I was the kind of person who told those stories. I still am, in a way, committed to evidence, quick to point out memory's slipperiness, the way adrenaline rewrites details. I call myself an atheist for the clarity it gives when approaching strange claims. But that doesn't mean I'm immune to being unsettled, and it certainly doesn't mean my skepticism is unbreakable. These are first-person accounts, people who answered a knock, who looked through glass and saw eyes that weren't eyes at all. I curated them because they share a pattern, the face of a child, the void where a pupil and sclera should be, a cadence of politeness that chills more effectively than a shout. They are accounts from regular people, house-sitters, delivery drivers, teenagers on their porches. They don't begin with an intent to terrify. They start the way most of life does, mundane, ordinary, then subtly wrong. The knock is patient. The voice is too polite. The animals notice first. I'll be upfront. I don't believe in monsters. I don't sign up for folklore whole cloth. But I also don't enjoy being told to ignore a pattern that keeps repeating in different places with the same unnatural heartbeat. So I set aside the instinct that wants to tidy everything into natural explanations and listened. The accounts I collected, edited slightly for clarity, preserved in tone, did not line up with a single neat explanation. That bothered me more than anything else. It starts, almost always, with the threshold. The house-sitting job was supposed to be simple. Feed the animals, sleep in the guest house at the back of a farmhouse, water a few pots, pick up the mail. The estate sat back from the lane, hedged and unlit, the kind of place a city person might romanticize without ever dealing with the wind that comes off open fields in November. The witness, 27, careful with details, became curiously good at conveying the evening smallness. A bowl of stew cooling on the counter, a radio left on low, a cat that avoided her like someone with a premonition. That animal detail matters. Animals notice more than we give them credit for. She told me the storm came up out of nowhere. Not a weather report storm, but a specific, focused wind that seemed to strike the house and then circle it, as if testing for weakness. The lights flickered. The dog on the neighbor's farm started barking in a pattern that wasn't dog barking. It was urgent, not territorial. And then there were the knocks. A polite knocking, 3 short raps repeated several times, patient as someone dismissing a minor inconvenience. When she peered through the small upstairs window, she didn't expect to find children. There had been no cars on the lane for hours. She expected, at worst, an awkward solicitor. Instead, she saw 3 figures at the bottom of the path, small, 3 silhouettes huddled together, faces turned up toward the house. They didn't run. They didn't look lost. They stood under the porch light as if it were their cue. She watched them from a distance. Their clothes were ordinary, jackets, jeans, the kind of hand-me-down layers you see on kids who spend time outdoors. It was the faces that made her forget to breathe. When one of them tilted its head towards the window and smiled, she could see the eyes clearly. Not pupils, not the usual white, but an absolute dark, a smooth, glossy black that swallowed the porch light. No reflection, no moisture, just a void where eyes should be. She closed the curtain. Her hands shook so badly that the curtain did not meet evenly. She let the radio play louder, the human voice on the wireless filling the upstairs room with banal national news, until the smallness of household normality kept the darkness at bay. She told herself to be rational. Maybe it was a trick of shadow and distance. Maybe it was contact lenses. Maybe she was tired. The dog, meanwhile, was nowhere to be found. The neighbors' gates were silent. They knocked again, a small, muffled tap on the guest house window. Different cadence. Not the same 3 raps, but a slow, searching knock like fingertips reading grain. I tried the peephole, she said, but I couldn't see much. Just 3 shapes. When one of them pressed against the glass, it sounded like someone had put their cheek to the window. Their breath fogged the glass, except you could see nothing in the fog. It was like someone had painted the inside of their eyes black. She barricaded the door, not in the movie way, no chains, no heroic posturing. She pushed a chair against the handle, moved the mattress in front of the door, and curled up on the floor because movement was motion, and motion was attention, and she didn't want attention.
She didn't call anyone at first. Phone reception at the guest house was patchy, like the kind of isolating silence that teaches you patience for fear. Then, after 3 more raps that rhythmically matched the heartbeat in her throat, she called the homeowner. The owner's voicemail was full. No answer. After the 5th call, she started to think about leaving. She imagined slipping out through the back gate into the dark, driving until lights filled the horizon. But the car keys were on the kitchen counter, out of reach. She had to go past the scuttling sound that suggested bodies moving just beyond the porch roof. The whole house creaked in the wind.
The cat, small and unhelpful, rubbed at her ankle, then darted away into the shadow of the stairwell like it knew the route to the attic. "They said my name," she told me, quietly, like they were reciting the way a child recites their own favorite thing. Small syllables. My name. I stood there and I listened to my name come from the mouths of people I couldn't see, and the name sounded wrong when it came out of them. It came without inflection. Full stop. The idea that something outside had learned her name? How had it learned her name? She hadn't lived there long enough for the family to have told passers-by her details. No visitors had that access. Names require context. Names are personal. For a skeptic, a name being used incorrectly is the kind of misattribution that should have an easy provenance. Neighbor kids, a local family, a prank. But that never fully sat with her, because there was also the footage. When the homeowner finally checked the security cameras, morning because the storms had passed and daylight refuses the dramatic timing of terror, what he found in the footage made him call the police. The yard cameras showed 3 figures at the path, yes. They showed them standing, turning in unison, as if synchronized. They showed the porch light painting faceless shadows on the ground. But between frames, between 1 second and the next, there was a brief, static-laced jitter where the image seemed to skip, and then the kids were gone. No hurrying away, no running off down the lane, no further movement on camera. Just an abrupt blank patch of footage, and then nothing. When officers went out to walk the perimeter, they found no footprints aside from the ones made by the house sitter earlier that afternoon. Nothing to indicate 3 children had walked across the gravel. The dog that had cried at the beginning of the night was found crouched behind the neighbor's shed, shaking, ears flattened, refusing to be coaxed. No other animals in the area showed signs of disturbance. No tracks. Just a dog with a strangely wet muzzle, and a homeowner with a puzzled, tired face. She slept in the back seat of her own car that night, with the engine off and the radio playing news she didn't care about. The fact that she had been called by name stayed with her. The washed-out blackness of those eyes stayed with her. The human politeness, the inflectionless "let us in" she reported hearing through the walls, stuck to the memory like a stain. That was my first long interview. I sat in a small kitchen and recorded it, thinking it would be an odd, isolated case. People misremember things. Camera glitches happen. But it wasn't the only story with those elements. The blackness in the eye, the polite insistence, the animals noticing first. That pattern kept coming up. If you want to keep watching, if you want more of this, I'll bring more. Hit subscribe, and I'll keep digging. The next report I collected was shorter but sharper. A van parked at the edge of a lay-by on a trunk road in Dorset. An overnight shift. A courier taking a nap in the cab while his stepfather, Trevor, nodded in the passenger seat, with the engine ticking and the heater going down. They were between jobs. The driver had the awareness of someone used to solitude. Long-haul people learn to sleep in weird places. It was the kind of vulnerable rest that makes a person easy prey for any oddity the night decides to throw their way. He woke to tapping on the cab window, not at the side, not at the back, right against his face, soft fingertips performing an invisible Morse. He rolled down the window fractionally, because you do that automatically. You are curious. You are not ready for full horror yet. He expected small hands, a lost child, someone asking for directions or money. He was tired and mollified. There were 2 girls at the window. He described them as young, maybe 9 to 11, clutching each other's shoulders the way kids do when the evening makes everything larger. They smiled. They spoke in tandem, in voices too uniform for anyone who's ever spent time watching children in groups. "Can we come in?" one of them asked, polite to the point of manners. "It's cold." He got an instinctive look for parental supervision. Were adults nearby? And then noticed the driver's stepdad Trevor in the passenger seat, awake now and sitting very still. Trevor's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, like he had been holding himself in place. He looked like a man who had been allowed 1 unit of panic and was saving it for later. It's one thing to see a child at the window. It's another to see eyes that do not reflect the streetlight.
The driver told me later that he could see nothing but black, as if someone had filled the eyes with ink and varnished them until they became lenses of silence. The girls leaned closer, as if to speak directly into his ear, and for a second the driver's vision tunneled the way it does during sleep deprivation. He felt, not thought, an intimacy that was wrong, an order placed upon his chest that made his skin itch. He rolled up the window and locked the doors. The girls knocked again, politely, once, and then left in unison. No hurry, no chaos, just a smooth, synchronized retreat. Trevor refused to drive them down the lay-by in the morning to look for footprints. He simply said he'd seen enough of some things to know you don't chase ghosts in the daylight. Sometimes chasing adds fuel to the idea. It's worth noting Trevor's reaction because not every witness is wide-eyed with superstition. Trevor had a fatherly, pragmatic face. He'd fixed engines, worked nights, raised kids. He was not easy to unnerve. He avoided temples of hysteria, and yet even his practical, stoic presence folded into caution that night.
If steady, non-dramatic types like Trevor can have that kind of freeze, you begin to notice that this phenomenon doesn't solicit drama, it demands stillness. Short things are often the most unsettling. The next segment is a montage of such brief intrusions, the everyday turned oddness that punctures the muscle memory of normal life. A suburban homeowner with a turkey cooling on the counter, Thanksgiving, family in another room, heard 3 polite taps and an identical phrase repeated outside the back door. Nobody was home to be playing a joke. The sound pattern was slow, patient, a contrarian rhythm against holiday chatter. When the witness peered out, a pale face hovered under the eaves, the eyes blackened so thoroughly the porch light seemed to die in reflection. She shut the blinds and refused to open the back door again that night. The family later found that the front porch camera had recorded a soft figure pausing, turning its face to the house, and then nothing at all, a gap of static like a frame missing from a film. A teenage girl told me about being at her bedroom window scrolling through a phone and hearing the soft insistence against the glass. She opened the curtains just a crack, and there was a small face at the edge of the yard, staring up at the house with a disconcertingly adult patience. The witness described feeling watched in a way that made her stomach twist, an old animal alarm. When she flicked on the light, the child's eyes reflected nothing. She closed the curtains, locked her door, and stayed up until dawn. Another person called in late, delayed, breathless, about a night when their television had flickered to static, and for a handful of minutes showed the shadowed outline of 2 small heads facing each other, lips moving as if reciting something. The witness hit record on the set-top box and rewound, but where the kid should have appeared on playback, the footage showed only snow and a small patch of distorted pixels, like a bruise on a screen. When they played the recording back in the morning for a friend, the clip restarted at the ordinary program. The friend shrugged. TV glitches happen, but the witness still had the cold spot in their memory where the faces had been. Make no mistake, daytime, cameras, living rooms, these things do not provide a shield. They are scenes on which the ordinary becomes uncanny. The pattern persists across places. 3 taps, polite wording, blackness where eyes should be, animals that notice first, electronics that jitter. The same ingredients recur like notes in a dissonant song. One account that bothered me because of its daylight proximity involved a guy who worked maintenance on neighborhood HVAC systems. He went from house to house, spending hours in attics, in backyards, near the hum of furnaces. On a bright Tuesday in late spring, he paused at a bungalow to measure an outside unit. A child, no more than 7, was standing beside the garage, clutching a torn soft toy, looking directly at him. The kid's mother was nearby, tending a flower bed, and paid no attention at all. He later told me he tried to make conversation the way you do with a child, asking about school, about the toy. The child answered in short, clipped sentences with an unusual politeness that felt librarian-level rehearsed. "Can we come in?" the child asked, holding the worn plushie out as if making an offer. The suite of contradictions made him step back. He remembered thinking, not logically, that the child asking to enter while the parents stood inches away made no sense. People who work with kids and families, teachers, community workers, have catalogs of normal gestures to draw on. This one didn't fit. What unsettled him most, and what I find myself returning to when I close my eyes, was how the mother treated the child's presence, as if the child were ordinary, nothing exceptional, as if any other neighbor might lean over and say hello. She didn't look at the child's face. She pruned roses while the child asked to be let inside. Sometimes witnesses report an odd dissonance between children and adults at the same scene, the children glaringly present, the adults in a kind of idiomatic blindness. You can see this in several accounts. The adult nearby who seems not to notice, or notices and shrugs it away, while the house cat goes boneless on the rug. I asked the HVAC worker if he'd ever felt scared that day, and he was candid. "No," he said, "not at first. And then something in me shut down, like my body went into conserve mode. I got the job done and left, and I didn't think about it properly for weeks. Only when I started hearing similar stories did the feeling come back like a bruise. We're not at the edge of the story yet. In my collecting, the accounts built in intensity not by bloodshed or grotesque spectacle, but by braiding detail into pattern. One person's gap in footage, another person's dog howling. The driver stepped at looking like a man who had stored up panic in a safety deposit box. These are the things that undermine confidence. There are tiny human moments I preserve because they make these reports real and not just theatrical. A neighbor who promised to check the cameras and whose face went the color of plaster. A teenage girl who took a week off school because she couldn't sleep with windows closed. A courier who avoided a particular lay-by after that night and changed routes for months. Believability is not about the unusual claim. It's about how ordinary lives bend and rearrange themselves in the aftermath. If you pulled every thread apart and tried to find a single plausible, mundane explanation, pranks, mass hallucination, camera malfunction, you would not be wrong to do so. Each case, isolated, often yields a reasonable alternative.
But when those alternatives line up in different places and on different nights, with the same marks in each seam, kids looking normal, eyes that are blank and black, steps that leave no impression, then there is at least a professional curiosity worth following. It's not belief, it's not conviction, it's an unsettled ledger. I'll admit I wanted a decisive refutation. I wanted to be able to say categorically, camera artifacts, attention-seeking teens, or my personal favorite, an overabundance of coincidence. The more I listened, the less tidy that answer became. Some nights, doubt is a comfort. Some nights, it's the only honest position. But doubt does not exempt me from acknowledging when a pattern persists. One thing all these witnesses told me, in different words, in different tones, was the way those eyes reduced them. Not just in the moment of seeing, but later, when memory softened everything, except the hole where the eyes had been. Some described waking at odd hours with their imagination replaying those faces. Others said they had a sudden aversion to thresholds, porches, windows, cars with interior lights in the dark. Small changes accumulate. Safety measures follow as a human response. Someone installs extra locks. Someone refuses to house sit again. Someone else changes the route they take home at night. Simple, common sense changes. No rituals, no conspiracies, just the human calculus of avoiding the thing that once made your stomach drop in a way your rational brain could not explain. I had intended to stop with these middling but still unsettling pieces, a slow burn to make my point. Then I received a set of accounts that pressed harder. They included official-sounding interactions, police visits, camera footage analyzed at station computers, 911 call transcripts, but what troubled me most was nothing the paperwork could explain away. It was the way names were used, the way the polite, unnerving phrase kept popping up, the way animals, always animals, noticed before humans did. I'll take you into one of those calls next, but before I do, one small thing. Keep a note in your head about timing. The episodes I collected begin late and get louder as the night goes on. They are patient in the worst way. If a knock appears in the small hours, it's not trying to startle you. It's trying to see if your life can be reconfigured into acceptance. That's the threatening part, the slow erosion. The next story came in the form of a 911 call. The voice on the line was clipped, not a hysteric. There was an odd economy to someone reporting the abnormal, as if describing a blown fuse. The caller said that two small figures had been at a property's back gate, and that officers, when they arrived, found no sign of forced entry and no footprints. The dispatcher logged the scene, the officers walked the yard, and the cameras, like so many other cameras, had a patch of missing footage.
An officer who responded later told me off the record that he'd seen enough to categorize the report as odd rather than criminal. That distinction is important because it means professional eyes had seen something that didn't fit the usual categories of domestic disturbance or prank. But the official record was thin, where the memory was not. The caller had insisted, in a whisper low enough to be almost private, that one of the children had said their name. That dawned on me the way a slow, low bell might. This was no longer merely about a look or a knock. It involved knowledge that shouldn't have been given. The call ended with the dispatcher telling the caller to lock their doors and stay inside. Standard procedure, sensible advice. But for many of the people I spoke to, the sensible advice was not the point. The point was what pressed against the window and asked to be let in with irritating, almost childlike politeness.
The edges of these stories are softer where the paperwork begins. Paperwork rarely captures what it feels like to have your name echoed back to you by a voice that is not quite yours, by a mouth that is a few inches of darkness away. That's where I will pause for now. I'm collecting the rest. Witnesses who refuse to go back to their kitchens, drivers who rerouted forever, teenagers who now sleep with lights on, and I'm assembling camera stills, timestamps, and more interviews. There are patterns I want to test, correlations I want to follow. But patterns do not equal answers. They do, however, form an invitation to take seriously what otherwise seems like an urban whisper, and to consider how ordinary life contorts when confronted with the implausible. Later, I'll tell you about the case that convinced me to stop trying to rationalize every instance away, a moment when the phenomenon breached routine, when a name was used clearly and deliberately, and when the people involved were not prone to melodrama. That one made me think differently about what a child could mean when entered into the wrong frame. For now, remember this. If something polite and insistent taps at your window in the dead of night, you do not owe it courtesy. You owe yourself caution. Keep the blinds drawn. Keep the locks engaged. Most of all, keep your wits about you, because some things come to the threshold not to be invited in, but to see whether you will open. The call that finally made me stop treating this as neat curiosities came in pieces. An audio file, a transcript, an officer's tired aside, and then a witness willing to speak at length. I replayed the call more times than I care to admit. It begins, patiently, almost politely, with a voice that is not yelling, not hysterical, just small and precise. "Hello, it's me," the caller says. "There are 2 little ones at the gate. They're asking to come in." There's no screaming. There's no breathless, high-volume panic.
That's what haunted me, the flatness of a report that should have been frayed at the edges. The dispatcher's voice is the low, practiced calm you hear when someone has to treat fear like form filling. Can you tell me your address? Are they still there? Are you safe inside? Standard questions. The caller answers each in sentences that are measured but tremulous enough to be real. Then the call tilts. "One of them said my name," the caller whispers, and you can hear the weight of that sentence in the pause that follows. The dispatcher asks them to stay inside and wait. Officers are dispatched. That's in the log. The officers arrive, walk the perimeter. They check cameras. The report in the system uses the word odd more than once. Cameras show a yard, empty, until a small segment of footage, 2 frames, 3, glitches in a way that leaves a hole like a missing tooth in an otherwise ordinary mouth of footage. After the hole, the gate is undisturbed. The witness who gave me access to the call insisted I listen to more than the recording. She wanted me to understand the way the voice reported what had happened, not as a story to tell her friends, but as something that needed cataloging. "We were just sat there with the kettle on," she told me. "My husband was in the garden. The kids were at their grandparents'." Nothing. Then this. 2 little heads at the gate, looking at me like there was something to be done. She kept returning to the name. "They said my name." Sounded exactly like how I say it in my head, only wrong, like someone had learned the phrase but not the feeling that goes with it. It is tempting to file this under misidentification, under the occasional theater of memory. We do it with most anomalous reports. But these calls bothered me because they matched echoes from other, independently submitted accounts. A name called back with no visible origin, audio and video that hiccuped in the exact place the present should have been, and officers who left with a shrug and a ticket stub of confusion. The official records were thin. The memories were not. One of the police officers I spoke with, on background and with more impatience than he meant, told me that cases like this land in the odd things folder. "We've had prank calls," he said. "We've had kids messing about. We've had folks with attention grabs. But sometimes you walk a yard at 2 a.m., you check the cameras, and there's a blank patch on the footage where a person should be. Cameras don't lay down blank patches for fun. There's a technical explanation sometimes. Sometimes there isn't." He told me he had heard people make the black eyes description at veteran roll calls more than he'd like. He had not, in his long service, seen anything that required him to revise an ontology of the night. He had seen enough, he said, to be willing to believe in strange local things without rewriting law books about them. There's an odd humility to that kind of response.
Professionals rarely lean into myth in official records. They try to keep it clean. And yet when enough clean records point to anomalies, when dogs are found cowering behind sheds and cameras have missing frames and names are echoed back in tones that are not human, the deliberative side of skepticism starts to feel undutifully thin. I'll tell you about Connor next. You're going to hear his name referenced a lot in these stories because he's the one who forced the pattern into an uncomfortable clarity. Connor is 31. He's pragmatic, not dramatic, an electrician by trade, steady hands, practical jokes limited to swapping a colleague's screwdriver for a spanner and calling it a day. He'd grown up in the sort of landscape that makes you trust the world's mechanics. Wires, poles, meters, the uncompromising logic of current and resistance. He worked nights sometimes doing emergency repairs. When he talks about that night, he does so in a cadence that reads like someone trying to keep an engineering schematic behind the terror. He was house-sitting for a friend, a long, bright house on the edge of a village, hedges, a lane that did not see much traffic. He was asleep in the spare room when a knock came, 3 soft raps on the front door. That sound seems to have a way of announcing itself in these accounts. Patient, polite, almost rehearsed. He sat up. He looked at the clock. It was 2:45 in the morning. He walked to the front window, because an electrician does that, he said. He wanted to check the lock, the door's fit, whether the hinges were loose. When he peered through, he saw 3 small faces. They stood under the porch light, as if they'd come from the dark to the one place humans choose to hold on to. They weren't shouting, they weren't pleading, they were precise. One of them, innocuous, smiling, small, tipped their head and said, plainly, "Connor, will you open the door?" He froze. He didn't recognize the faces. He had not given his name out. He had not talked to anyone on that house's street in months. "How did they know my name?" he asked me later. He asked the question like a problem to be solved with wiring diagrams and a multimeter. He whispered into the phone that night and called the friend he was sitting for. The friend slept through the calls. He buttoned the bedroom door and lay awake with the smallness of the knock repeating behind it. The porch light buzzed. The knock never turned angry. It was patient. Then, faint through the walls, he heard a voice, quiet, rehearsed, absolutely devoid of the twitch of infancy or the high pitches you'd expect, and it said, "We can come in." He swore to me he did not open the door. He did, however, tell me he almost did. He admitted this with the kind of embarrassment a rational person reserves for a near cowardice that almost looked like curiosity.
He remembered, in that stretched half-second, the picture of a child. He remembered their clothes, their coordinated way of leaning on each other, their small, glossy eyes. He said it felt like being remembered in a way that bypassed consent. It was as if they wanted to be let in, he said, and all they needed was a name. When the homeowner checked the external camera in the morning, the footage showed 3 silhouettes at the porch at 2:45 a.m., filmed by the security system. The figures stood. The porch light spattered their shapes across the gravel. And then, in a literal hiccup of footage, there was a clump of static, and they were gone. The camera's metadata recorded a 3-second blank patch with corrupted frames. Officers who reviewed it shrugged again. Cameras could fail, they said. But Connor is an electrician. He knows cameras. He pulled the footage off the homeowner's cloud, examined the feed, checked the recording intervals, and told me he was not satisfied. For him, technical failure is a solvable thing. This was not a simple bit error. It was as if the tape had been edited in the space of a single night. He felt watched for days afterward, and he started carrying a small recorder that he admitted made him feel less foolish than the thought that he might be losing his mind. I'll say something blunt. Part of what made Connor's case stick in my head was his insistence on machinery and verification. Here was a man who understood noise and signal. If anyone could have rationalized this, it was him. He could have said, "There's your explanation. Faulty camera, a prank, sleep deprivation." He didn't. He told me what he'd seen and let the facts sit like a bundle on the table. The police log noted the incident as an oddity and moved on. No arrests, no footprints. The dog from next door was found afterwards, not barking with a neighborly indignance, but flattened and shivering beneath a shrub. The homeowner added a second deadbolt and called it a night. Connor took a book and left the lights on and sat drinking tea in a neighbor's kitchen until dawn. He refused to house-sit for that friend again. It's tempting to let these stories remain isolated badges of strangeness. They become harder to compartmentalize when you notice how often animals react first. I kept seeing the same detail: a horse that refused to be saddled, a cat that hid in a chimney, a dog that flattened itself as if trying to escape something that only it could see. Animals do not tell stories. They act. They flee, freeze, or howl.
and to me those reactions started to read like a chorus line of alarm bells. Take the case of the couple who lost a horse that night in late autumn. They lived on a small holding on the edge of a broad common. The husband was out in the field with the animals that evening, checking fences, when the dog started to howl. The horse bolted from its stall and refused to be brought back in.
The couple walked the boundary lines, torches cutting grease across hedges, and found nothing that explained the animal's agitation. Later, their feed cam showed a pair of small figures at the gate, two little heads bent together, then a flicker where the video briefly jumped, and then the figures were gone. There were no hoof prints beyond what the animals themselves had left. The couple moved the animals to a stable farther away for a week, just to sleep easier. There is an understated cruelty to these episodes, the way they make ordinary people change things they had never thought to change. They do not demand a ritual, they demand practical adjustments. Install better locks, change routes for late-night drives, refuse to sleep upstairs with windows open. The changes are mundane, anticlimactic, and oddly human. Worry, don't terror. Move, don't fixate. Keep animals inside. Call a neighbor. Make noise. Those are not instructions for summoning anything. They are the common-sense responses people who've been touched by the phenomenon took because their anxiety was not soothed by rationalization. Not all the encounters happen at night. One of the testimonies I collected came from a petrol station attendant on a late-night shift. She was alone. The forecourt was empty except for a couple of trucks. It was the dead air you get between busy hours. She had worked nights long enough to build a tolerance for the low-grade tension those shifts bring. Around 1:10 a.m., while she was stocking snacks, she heard a polite knocking at the glass door. Two small figures were standing outside, hands pressed to the display window, faces turned up at her. They smiled like they were waiting for a friend to come and open the door. "You all right?" she called, because that's what you do. It seemed the right thing to check that they were not lost. One of them said, in a tone startlingly steady, "Can we come in? It's very cold." The attendant's radio hissed with static at that moment. Her monitor flickered with a brief spasm, and a pale patch of pixels bubbled on the CCTV replay later. She told me she wasn't frightened at first. She felt a comic absurdity. Children sometimes play trick on night workers. She waited to see an adult appear. None did. The trucks hummed on the forecourt. The dogs that would sometimes wander in were not there. She flicked on an interior light, and the faces at the window, small, upturned, didn't reflect the store lights in the way kids' eyes usually do. The reflection was absent. Her mouth went dry. As she locked the door from the inside, her fingers working with habitual practiced speed, the children in the glass smiled and turned away at the same time. They walked across the forecourt as if stepping to the cadence of something she couldn't hear. She was sure she saw their heads dim, like someone had dragged a black cloth over a light. The CCTV later showed figures walking off camera at a normal speed.
The official footage had no record of them dissolving. Her own memory was stubbornly precise. A polite knock, a request to come in, black eyes, and then an absence that didn't quite fit the normal rules. Another pattern that began to loom larger for me was how electronics often seem to misbehave around these encounters. Phones lose signal, TVs flutter into static, radios pick up a snippet of music that isn't there anymore. Engineers and electricians shrugged. Interference, they said. Maybe. The coincidence rate kept climbing. If interference is a cause, then it is a very polite, very particular sort of interference, the kind that locates itself only where a presence is reported. There's one account that lingered with me because it combined a daytime setting, adult presence, and a directness that felt like a line drawn across all the other cases. A delivery driver, middle-aged with a strong aversion to bedtime stories, was making a routine drop in a suburban cul-de-sac when two small heads appeared at his van's sliding door. They banged on the glass, just beyond reach, and spoke in unison, "Let us in." He told me he did not have time for nonsense. He had parcels to deliver and a route to keep. He rolled down the window an inch, bright with impatience, to ask them to leave. One of them placed a small hand on the glass and said, "We know where your kid sleeps." The phrase jarred like a thrown stone. He slammed the window up and locked the van. He drove away with his hands shaking. He later checked his CCTV at home and found no evidence of anyone being by the van at that time. The child's comment, whether a stray joke or something else, did something more subtle than fright. It crossed a threshold of intimacy, a rehearsal of knowledge that was private and not given. That kind of breach appears in many accounts, a mention of a name, a precise knowledge of a habit, a calm insistence that presumes an intimacy not earned. And then there are the accounts that refuse tidy summation because they reach into deeper wells of human fear. One of the people I spoke to was a teenager whose story reads like the classic porch knock horror. Late-night scrolling, a soft rap at the window, a small face that looks up with black void eyes. She said she laughed it off at first. It was common in her neighborhood for teenagers to hang out and mess about.
But when the child at the window put their palm flat to the glass and said, "It's so lonely inside," she felt her throat close. She locked the window and texted a friend. The friend didn't answer immediately, and she spent the rest of the night waiting for her phone to buzz. She didn't sleep. She changed the blinds. These are not stories of personal failing or hysteria. They are not manufactured attention-seeking. They are accounts of people who simply encountered a repetition of small perturbations that mounted until they became an undeniable pressure.
My interviews began to pile up. House sitters, couriers, petrol attendants, teenagers, maintenance workers, officers. Each one contributed a different color to the same unsettling pattern. The more I listened, the more I found myself cataloging motifs as if I were assembling a field guide to unease. The polite phrase, the blackness of the eyes, the animals that reacted first, electronics that stuttered, the use of names, the abrupt vanishings on camera. Individually explainable, together, strange. Near the end of my collecting, I was sent a piece of footage that made my rational heart lurch. It wasn't footage of the children themselves, it was footage of the aftermath. A homeowner had placed a cheap wildlife camera by the hedgerow because something had disturbed his garden for several nights in a row. When he checked the recorder in the morning, he found a single frame, literally one frame, showing 3 small heads peering up from the grass. The frame before and after were empty. He enhanced it, he color-corrected it, he asked someone with better software to interrogate the file. The image showed no eyes. It showed glossy, reflective pupils eaten by a smooth blackness. The image, frozen, looked like a hole in the garden where light should be. I'm an atheist who likes an explanation. I like them the way a mechanic likes a spare part. But I kept running into accounts where the mechanical explanation did not quite fit. Cameras can glitch, people can misremember. But a frame is a frame, a dog is a dog. When the same odd marks turn up in different places with no connection, black eyes, polite requests, animals unsettled, it becomes less about supernatural labels and more about pattern recognition. Call it probability, call it correlation. For me, it became an invitation to watch, to pay attention, and to be careful. Which brings us back to the question that chased me nightly. What would you do if a small voice asked to be let in? The answer keeps changing across these accounts. Most people did not open their doors. Most made practical choices. They locked doors, they called neighbors, they barricaded, some slept in cars. I spoke to one elder couple who placed the radio on full blast and played a tape of their grandson singing nursery rhymes until dawn. We wanted ordinary noise, the woman told me. If they wanted to get inside, they'd have to get through noise first. It is important to say this because a few people online have used these stories to craft stories of heroism or instruction. That is not what any of the witnesses wanted. They wanted to be left alone. They wanted the weirdness to recede. They wanted someone to listen without telling them they were wrong. They wanted to be believed, or at least treated with the courtesy of not being mocked. And yet, the phenomenon is not merely about fear. It leaves lasting traces. I spoke to a couple who'd moved from their house because their toddler refused to sleep in the room a child had once occupied.
A man in his 40s refused to work late at night after a single episode of being tapped at his van. A teenager admitted to me, with genuine shame, that she checked her bedroom window every night for months. These are human rearrangements around an unexplained pressure, the shift of ordinary life away from a place where the rules once felt stable. Toward the end of my travels, I sat with a woman whose story complicated my tidy categories. She had been a 911 operator years before and had handled calls that would have broken a less steady nerve. She listened to calls colored by grief, by panic, by sudden deaths. She told me quietly that the call I'd heard before, 2 small ones at the gate, was not the only call that had left a residue on professionals. We always took precautions, she said. We always advised people to stay inside and lock doors. But occasionally we would have a line that made us put on the headphones again and listen, not to the facts, but to the tone. There are tones phones make when someone is telling the truth about something they do not understand. She described a call where a father said that children at his back fence called to his dog and said, "We have been watching him sleep." He said it with a dryness that was almost comical until the dog started to howl in the background on the line. The operator told me she rerouted a patrol anyway, because you do not ignore a caller whose pets are behaving like that. Officers checked the yard. The officer's notes said nothing overtly paranormal. The camera footage at the house showed a patchy interference at the precise time of the call. The animal was found the next morning shaking in the shed, not physically wounded but transformed in temperament. "It's not evidence," she said. "It's pattern." Her voice had the wary cadences of someone who has seen patterns without being obliged to name them. There is a temptation at this point to provide a tidy taxonomy. Natural cause, technology error, mass hoax, supernatural event. The temptation to tidy is the oldest human tendency. We want our fears labeled and shelved. And yet the data resists neatness. People with technical competence point at corrupted frames and say, "That's technical."
People with animal experience point to the dogs and say, they know. People with skeptical bones point to the simplest explanation they can bear. The result is an overlapping web of partial answers, each plausible in isolation, none conclusive in the aggregate. I do not want to leave you with the impression that I am asking you to accept monsters into your belief set. I am asking you to accept uncertainty and to take seriously how ordinary lives change after an inexplicable episode. If you had asked me a year ago whether I would be giving credibility to a string of polite knocks, I would have laughed at the notion. Now I don't laugh, I catalog.
And I want to be clear about one ethical line I observed in my work. None of the people I interviewed wanted to call down moral judgment or supernatural labels. Few mentioned demons or aliens unprompted. They used plain language. It was wrong. It felt unnatural. It knew things it should not have known. They were more interested in the practical, their names being used, their animals spooked, their homes feeling less safe. One case I never expected to tell was from a woman who lived alone and ran a small bed and breakfast. She had a little dog who stayed in the kitchen and slept in a crate. One night she had been woken by gentle tapping at the kitchen window. She went down, bleary, and saw a small face. She opened the window a crack, and the child put one hand to the glass and smiled. "Let us see the dog," the child said. She shut the window and put the deadbolt in. The dog had been found in the morning with his fur slicked as if he'd been crying, the dog's whole body loose with a fear animals sometimes carry. The woman said she had never felt so watched in her home. She moved rooms for a week and put a motion sensor light on the garden. "I didn't want to make them mad," she said, half in jest, half in earnest. "I wanted to be safe." Towards the very end, after dozens of interviews and pieces of footage, I found myself staying out later at night, not because I wanted to find them, but because I had begun to care about what these things did to people. I wanted to understand how a polite knock at 3 in the morning could become a pivot in someone's life. It was not a fascination with the phenomenon, so much as a compassion for its consequences. I'll tell you frankly, the pattern persisted, and my skepticism, always a reliable tool, did not break so much as shift. It took on a new, more careful posture. I stopped being dismissive of nervous laughter and started being interested in the pragmatic changes people made after being visited by something apparently polite and persistent. I stopped assuming that every camera hiccup had a mundane explanation. I started listening to the hum under the words, the dogs that went quiet in the morning, the children who said a name they should not have known, the way a porch light would halo 3 small faces and then render them unrecorded. The phenomenon is not a tidy myth. It is an irritant. It scratches at the varnish of ordinary nights. It arrives as children do, small, unassuming, polite, and yet something in the way they ask is wrong. People have suggested theories. Some believe folklore, that entities take the form of children to lower your guard. Others mutter about mass hallucination or suggestible witnesses. Technicians blame interference. I have an awkward respect for all these views. None alone resolves the totality of reports. They are overlapping lenses, and what they reveal depends on where you place the light. Here's the practical truth I felt ethically obliged to pass on. If a child with eyes like voids asks to be let in, do not engage. That is not metaphysical advice, it is a safety recommendation grounded in the accounts I collected. In nearly every case, the people who engaged, who opened doors, who chased figures, who left their houses, reported outcomes that left them more unsettled. Those who secured themselves and called someone or waited until morning often described losing only a night's sleep and gaining an admonition to be more careful. Do not play hero in a situation you cannot verify. That is the simple caution that threads these stories together. I also want to acknowledge the human cost. People changed their routines. Children in the homes where incidents occurred slept with lights on. Couples installed extra locks. One man I spoke to said he'd avoided a lane he used to drive down at night after his own brush. A woman who once loved house-sitting now refuses even polite invitations. These changes are small, quotidian, and entirely understandable. They are the real aftershocks of the uncanny. So where does that leave us? Not at a door marked answers, but at a corridor where each room has a plausible sign. We can insist that every glitch has a technical fix, that every name called is the product of a strong imagination, or we can admit that something odd has been documented often enough to merit concern. For my part, I have moved from genial skepticism to cautious attention. I no longer assume that every pattern will untangle itself with a single tidy explanation. Instead, I respect the pattern for what it is, a cluster of anomalies that has consequences for ordinary people. It is tempting and irresponsible to end with a flourish that claims understanding. I can't do that. What I can offer is what the witnesses asked for, a careful listening and a sober warning. If there is an advantage to keeping a skeptical posture, it's that it keeps us from falling into fear-based superstition. But skepticism is not an obligation to disbelief. It is a methodology, and methodology includes the willingness to revise when data accumulates. One last thing before we close. You might be awake now because the knocking in your mind has started. Maybe you're thinking of your porch, your driveway, the times you let your guard down. That's normal. That's precisely the sensation these stories produce, a slightly altered relation to thresholds. Keep the ordinary defenses in place. Don't help anything that announces itself at your door by being polite. Call a friend. Call the police if you feel threatened. Keep your animals inside if they're showing signs of stress. And if something calls your name, humor me here. Treat it like a stranger with oddly detailed information. Close the door. I'm still collecting accounts.
I'll continue this series if you want more. If you want footage, if you want interviews, if you want me to keep probing the cold little places where the ordinary leaks into the strange. But for now, I'll end with the observation that told me more than any single camera glitch or dog's whine. Ordinary people who once slept with the windows open changed small things about their nights and never went back. The pattern is not dramatic. It is quiet, patient, persistent. It keeps you awake. If you want more full-length compilations and the source material I used, subscribe and check the description. And one last thing. If a polite voice asks to be let in, if the knock is soft, if the eyes are wrong, do not engage. Close the door. Call someone. Keep your lights on. Keep your animals safe. Keep your wits. Thank you for listening.